All right, Joe, we're going to get started, so I'll make an introduction.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Thank
okay?
you all very much for attending today's webinar. Today's webinar will be about peer support, and it's presented by Dr. Joe Shapiro. Dr. Joe Shapiro is an associate professor of otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at Harvard Medical School. She's a senior educator for the Center for Medical Simulation in Boston and a consultant for the Massachusetts General Hospital Department of Anesthesia, Pain, and Critical Care. In 2008, Joe founded the Brigham and Women's Hospital Center for Professionalism and Peer Support, where she served as the director for over 10 years. During that time, the center became a model for institutions nationally and internationally seeking methods to enhance trust and respect and improve clinical well-being. She continues to assist organizations in developing specific programmatic approaches such as peer support and well-being initiatives. She's also involved in global health medical education and training. Dr. Shapiro received her BA from Cornell University and her MD from the George Washington University Medical School. Her general surgery training was at UC San Diego and UCLA. She did her otolaryngology residency at Harvard, followed by a year at the National Institute of Health Training Grant Fellowship. Joe, thank you very much. And as a notice to everyone, we are recording this and it will be posted on the Collaborative's website probably in about 3 weeks or so. So Joe, with that, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. And thank you all for taking your time to be present for this. I really would encourage, it's hard, I know webinars are tough in that interactivity way, but if there's a question you have or something you want to comment on, please feel free to let Steve know, and I'm happy to interrupt, etc. So we're in this all together. I hope to leave you with some really concrete steps if you decide peer support is something that you want to have in your organization. That's the whole goal, is being able for people to set something up. I'm going to use the model that that we've been using, but also that I've helped dozens of other organizations use. So that's the one I know, but no proof it's the best or what have you. It's just a way forward, and it's quite doable. And like I said, that's what I'm going to share with you. So let me just try to advance my slides. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks to the Collaborative for also for all the work the Collaborative is doing to get this system much better for the patients and for all of us. So I would just start off with the premise that our culture in medicine, regardless of what country or size of our organization or what state we're in, is sometimes lets us down, and it can be pretty isolating, blaming, and disempowering, as well as lacking humanity towards ourselves and each other and other people towards us. And I'm going to suggest that peer support is a culture change driver, which I think is really what has to happen for all of us if we're going to have more sustainable careers and also really learn from when things go wrong. So to start out with, because that's a pretty broad statement, I just want to make it very accessible. So culture is never written down. You can reflect and see if you've ever been anywhere where there's been a manual of culture. There never is, but we know from all the safety data and lots of other data that culture drives outcomes in a big way. So what is it? And this is just, I think, a great definition. It's patterns of relating that persist and change through ongoing interaction. So we can decide together ourselves that we're going to change the parts of the culture that are not really supporting us in doing the work that we all signed up to do. And that's what I'm going to talk about. The first thing I want to do is I want to make the case for why this is important. And I'm making it not that you don't know this, but I think it's really helpful, whatever position you are in your organization, to have a rationale for those who control resources as to why we have to pay attention to this. Because to be fair to all the leaders of our organizations, there's a lot of competing priorities. And I would make the case that this has to be at the top of the list. So here's the case that I'm going to make then feel free to use it if it helps get the resources you need to do the work that you want to do. And that is that culture drives safe care delivery. It also it drives clinician well-being as well as the learning environment, all things that I think anybody cares about in our organizations. I just put this up to remind me to say that I've had the opportunity to go to lots of different places and have, that have different microcultures. But what's so striking to me, even across different countries, is the similarity between the culture of medicine at all of these and other organizations. That I think we've inherited a culture, as I said, that can be great in some ways, but has parts that we need to change. And I did want to put this in the context of the well-being movement because I believe it's a huge driver of well-being and that we need to pay attention to. And because well-being is getting a lot of attention now, which is otherwise known as resources and thought, this has been my stance from the beginning when we started the Center for Professionalism and Peer Support, was to frame it in a well-being context, but it was a little bit before well-being had much traction. I think it's a lot, it has more traction now. I don't actually like this diagram, but I like the fact that these really wonderful people thought about it and tried to put this in a schema that we could think about, but it's basically how to do well-being efforts. And the thing that I don't like is that I think I think that it's not their fault, but when people were first talking about well-being, I think there was an overemphasis on kind of buck up, do more yoga, eat well, exercise better. And yes, those are good things. I'm not speaking against them, but it's not fair to ask us to deep breathe through a dysfunctional system. And I think that's what happened initially with thinking about well-being. I think every organization I've ever heard of has moved beyond that. So it's both personal resilience and some other issues. Efficiency of practice, of course, is a big one, and that we're not going to talk about that. But the culture of wellness, I would put that as, I think the culture infuses everything. How much where we use to focus our attention, all the interactions that we have. So I think it's a bit broader than this, but it's certainly known to be, in and of itself, a really important factor. So this is how I would lead into this. Let me just have you read that to yourselves. So I'm going to talk about peer support, particularly in the context of errors. The principles of a program and triggers for what peer support should be available for, they apply no matter what the trigger is or what the event is or the problem is. But it's hardest to peer support after errors, and so that's how I'll focus this discussion, but everything's really quite translatable to other uses of peer support. So I just want you to yourselves think of a time when you were involved in a medical error that caused patient harm or nearly did, and if you're not in clinical medicine itself, when you did something that inadvertently harmed somebody. So just think about that for a minute. Okay, so I never leave time for that, even if it were a small group facilitation. And the reason I don't leave time for that reflection is every single clinician I know remembers these moments. We just do. We don't have a lot of them in our career, which is good, but boy, do they sear themselves into our memory. And that's, of course, because we're wired to remember bad things. It's kind of life-saving. It's a survivor tactic, and we tend to really always remember these things. But I would invite you to think of next about what some of your emotions were. And I'm going to try this. If it doesn't work, I'll just do a summary that I think holds pretty true for people. But I would just invite anybody to you don't at all need to talk about what the event was, but just in a memory of any kind of emotion that you felt after you learned that something that you were involved in might have or did cause patient harm. Anybody able to just call out an emotion that you remember feeling, something you remember feeling from that time? Okay, this might not work on a webinar. Sometimes it does. I've done it before, but I'm gonna assume that you're like everybody else I've ever met and all the research subjects who've been queried on this, okay? And like I said, if you have something you want to say that I'm not covering or what have you, you can type it in, I think, in the chat to Steve, or just flag that you want to ask a question or say something.
Yeah, and Joe, you know what? I can unmute it. Would you like me to unmute everyone?
Oh, yeah, let's just see if anybody would be able to just call out an emotion.
Yep, everyone is unmuted right now, so go ahead.
I said shame.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Shame?
Shame, yeah, big time. I think that's what you said. That is so prominent for almost all of us, yep. Anyone else have a?
Don't be shy. It's Halloween.
Embarrassment.
Embarrassment, yes, totally, absolutely. Yep, big
Guilt.
time. Guilt, yes. Bingo, definitely.
Fear. Fear.
Fear, yeah. Fear is a big one. We'll talk a little bit more about the causes of fear, but absolutely, it's terrifying in some ways, exactly. Well, actually, thank you so much. Those are like absolutely the highlights of those, and I'm sure you'll have others. I sort of grouped them into. This comes from a lot. It comes from literature and also from being experienced and doing peer support. I'm going to group some of the emotions that are very common. One, obviously we're sad because we don't want to see people suffering. But shame, it really follows close on the heels of sadness. And shame is actually more than, it's expanded from guilt, like, oh, I feel so guilty that happened, to shame actually is when we associate what happened with ourselves, like who we are, our identity. So this happened because I'm a bad doc, or I am a bad nurse, or I'm inadequate, or I am not a good person. And it's very, very common for people to feel in these situations, for clinicians to feel. And with it, once you feel ashamed, then you start to wonder, again, if you are competent enough often to do this work that you've been doing that then inadvertently caused somebody harm. And I was always wondering about, why do we feel shame so consistently after errors? And I think it's part of our enculturation. And there was a study done by Helmreich that looked at the similarity between aviation and medicine, and found that both stress the need for perfection and a deep perception of personal invulnerability. So I think all of you will probably relate to the fact that we're, if not explicitly told, absolutely implicitly, that the way to prevent patient harm is to have absolutely perfect results, like perform perfectly every day, all the time. And that's what we strive for. And the problem with that is that it's literally impossible. You cannot perform perfectly because we're human. And we are going to make errors at fixed rates. We are. And so you cannot ever eliminate human error from any enterprise. You can do a lot to decrease the chances of it, or to create the system so that the chances are less that an individual will make an error, and also assume that errors will happen and make sure you have a system so they don't reach the patient. Those are all things we should be doing. But to enculturate us to think that no harm is going to come by perfect care, absence of error is completely, it's impossible. And so what happens then is you are expecting yourself to be perfect, and we expect each other to be perfect, and then we're not, obviously, because we're human and things will go wrong. So it's a real clash of what we think we should, things the way we think things should be and the way they actually are. And the other thing is, I think we're also enculturated, all healthcare providers, I think physicians in particular, that, it's such a high value to just tolerating stuff, to doing it. Like, put your head down, get your job done. It's not about you. You shouldn't be feeling anything. It's not supposed to hurt. signed up for this. You knew the risks. This isn't banking. This is really this part of the profession. Deal with it. Which is really impossible. It's fine in the moment, and it should be. Like, it's not about us in the moment acutely. You got to code the patient, and it doesn't matter how you're feeling, and can't leave the operating room. But forever to never process what happens, what we see, the kinds of things that we see, whether they're errors or just tragic things, that's where we've gotten into trouble. Assuming that we are in some ways inhuman and aren't going to take this in emotionally. And then I think also, we can usually fix things. So now we've created a situation that we might have made broken, if you will, and, we may not be able to fix it, and that feels really, really horrible. So I think, this is the other thing, that in medicine in general, we actually select for perfectionists, which, by the way, perfectionism is great until it isn't. It's absolutely a good thing to be perfectionistic to a point, but the problem is when things don't go well. And then again, perfectionism, even without errors, is a risk factor itself for depression, anxiety, burnout, and suicide. So you put that on top of what happens to your sense of perfectionism when you are imperfect, and you get a really bad mix of expectations. And as someone on the call said, thank you for putting this out there, I think a lot of us are afraid. And there are lots of things we're afraid of. One is lawsuits, obviously. We're all afraid of that. We're also big time afraid of our reputation. What will people think of me? Will they still refer to me? Will they trust me? And I think there's a lot of fear around that, which is quite well founded, actually. And I'll show you an example of that. And I think that we have other fears, like also patient and family's reaction, those sorts of things. So there's a lot actually to be afraid of, and then to be frustrated and angry about, because the way we're told we're supposed to be in medicine now we're not. So one is, I think we're hoping that when we go in and tell the patient what happened, that they'll say this, right? It's okay, don't worry about it, I understand, yeah, it's awful, but it's not your fault, or you were trying your hardest. And what I want to say about that is, if patients and families give you this gift, you should take it. It's absolutely wonderful, and be grateful for it. But there are a lot of people who talk about resilience, which is recovery after trauma, and this is traumatic for us, if you will, because that's what we're talking about, the clinicians, that the only way you can recover is to be forgiven by the patient and family. And I just want to say I disagree with that. I would say get your loving elsewhere. That it is not the family and patient's responsibility to take care of us. If they do have that instinct, it's lovely, but it's really on us to forgive each other and ourselves, and that's really what peer support is about. So there's often, and also patients sometimes are very angry or shut down, or they don't want to see us again, or what have you, and it is their right. They are allowed their emotions. Of course, we have to deal with the effect on us, but it's not up to them to make it better. And then the other thing is, I just would ask you, did you all get the memo in your organization that we're done with shame and blame? And of course, you didn't get a memo, because there isn't a memo. There will never be a memo, because it's a culture, right? And your culture isn't written down, and it wouldn't be translated from a memo anyway. And what I would propose is that, although probably every single one of us is in some kind of organization where we're working towards just culture and psychological safety, we're not there yet. We're just not there yet. And I want to point out that until we realize what parts of what we do after errors are still shame and blame, we're going to keep doing them, even though we say we're doing a just culture. So this is an example of a study where they looked at women surgeons, how their peers reacted to women surgeons versus male surgeons. And they found a differential kind of punishment by peers, which is that after a patient death, that women surgeons, their referrals dropped by 54%, while there wasn't a drop, there was a small stagnation of referrals for male surgeons. So this is actually around implicit or unconscious bias, but the thing is, what it shows is that unconsciously we are actually punishing physicians, other healthcare providers for adverse events. So this is just one example, but we do that, and I think you may acknowledge in yourself. I will do it for, on behalf of all of us, I believe, well, certainly on behalf of myself, is sometimes my reaction internally when I hear of a colleague who's made an error, my first internal reaction is, what was he thinking? But then, of course, the answer should be probably something really intelligent that at that moment seemed to be the right choice. But we're very judgmental as people. This isn't physicians or healthcare providers in particular. So we just have to recognize that it's very easy to jump to judgment, negative judgment, but you just have to do something to stop that from carrying the day. And yet it is a problem unless we recognize it. And then there's so many structures and processes in place that can act punitively, can act in a shame and blame way. It can be at certain M&Ms or root cause analysis or what we call collaborative case reviews. Sometimes they are not about a safety culture. They are very much who did what wrong, accuse, blame, criticize, the ABCs of an M&M, somebody once said. And not always, of course, but many times. Sometimes Department of Public Health gets in there and it, does a blamey kind of analysis. Sometimes people are reported to the Board of Registration in medicine. In other countries, they have something called the Inspectorate. Another country is the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. And they can all react very much in the shame and blame mode, just depending on that particular structure and then what group is doing the event analysis. And of course, then you have to think about our normal litigation system, which is, of course, what those of us on the call are there to change or stay away from, if you will. And there's nothing as shame and blamey as the current litigation system, because they really don't tend to sue systems, they sue people. And then, of course, sometimes people are tried and convicted in the media, whether it's print or social media. And it's pretty devastating. The sides of the story are not heard. The nuances are not out there for privacy reasons. And it's pretty devastating and very much in the shame and blame mode. So all of this can lead us to feeling quite isolated. And as you know, the first thing that a risk manager will tell you is don't talk to anybody when you report an event. And that's fair from a legal point of view. And you understand why, I know. I will talk to you a little bit later during this hour of what we have done to deal with this potential liability around peer support. But generally speaking, we are told don't talk to anybody, and that has to hold true in most of the cases. It leads us to feel extreme, plus how our peers might be treating us and how the organization might treat us, we feel quite isolated. And isolation is really stressful, both acute and chronically for humans, because we're really social beings, and feeling isolated is really pretty devastating. So my argument, and hopefully you can use this to say we have to do something about this, is that many people can be impacted after adverse events. Obviously, patient and family are the most important. We're going to discuss, of course, the impact on the physician, other healthcare providers, and sometimes the entire organization. All of these groups and people should have access to support. So that's the call to action. So to step back, I would say that all those reactions that you said and that I just summarized are normal. We would never want to train a generation of clinicians to say, well, hey, I'm human, I make mistakes, deal with it. No, it's normal and rational and incredibly important and human that we do feel bad. Of course we do, for all the right reasons, because we're compassionate and caring. And it is true that many times that these reactions just simply go away over time. but not always. And I'm just going to give you, again, for your use in arguing to do something about this, this is just some of the data of what can happen to clinicians after adverse events. So this was physicians in particular, is again just one study showing some of the high frequency of some bad things like increased anxiety about future errors, decreased job confidence, and job satisfaction. And if you look at this, this was true even when the error didn't reach the patient, which is amazing, but it just shows how caring we are and how much we take on, which is that we feel quite responsible for the care that happens and for things that we do. And so, it's not always exactly correlated with the degree of harm. And yet these are some potentially lasting reactions that people have. And this was a study we did. We compared a hospital in the UK to where I was previously at the Brigham, and we looked at both nurses and physicians on both sides of the pond. There was no difference between any of these groups, by the way. But looking all told, around 30% of those who were willing to be in this study had some negative impact on their work performance or personal life and colleague relationships. That's a lot of people suffering. We know that if you have said that you acknowledge and being willing to do these studies, these surveys, that you've made a medical error, that you have a higher chance of being depressed or burnt out. And so what the thinking is now, just from the data, that if you've made an error, you have a higher chance of becoming burnt out, and if you're burnt out, you have a higher chance of making a medical error. So it's bad, and we have to stop this cycle. We must stop it. We also know that if you just look at suicidal ideation, it goes up after having made an error. I mean, that's a big deal. That is a big deal. And then if you don't know the statistic, you should know it, and it's not to compare one side of the screen to the other, but this is just overall risk. If you look at the left side, if you're a physician, you're a male physician in the U.S., your chance of dying by suicide is 40% higher than other men in the U.S., and a woman physician in the U.S., 130% higher chance of dying by suicide than women in the U.S. That's awful. Now, I'm not suggesting that its all cause is due to errors, but you just saw the other slide. It's a risk factor, no question about it. And we should be doing everything we can to stop these suicides. Did you know that every single day in the U.S., and plus more than, at least one physician dies by suicide? Pretty awful. So the question was and is okay, we know it's a risky, vulnerable time for compassionate, caring clinicians after adverse events. So how do we facilitate coping and resilience? Resilience being defined as growth and recovery after trauma, the trauma being having harmed somebody. And so there was data that I was part of generating, and other people as well. I'm obviously just show you a couple things that would suggest that talking to a colleague is a healing factor. This one actually was shown to be correlated with those. These were physicians also who were in this study who had, were willing to this day had made a medical error, that those who ended up becoming resilient, actually, these were the factors that helped resilience. So one obviously was talking about it with colleagues. This was a study that we did that we looked at, we surveyed physicians, and we asked lots of questions about different emotional stressors. This particular question was an answer to, if you were involved in a medical error, where would you want to get support? And even though at our hospital, which is where this is done, we have really good mental health professionals, employee assistance program people, 88% wanted to talk to a physician colleague. So I think you have to build a program around what we know would be perceived to be helpful or actually is helpful for clinicians involved in errors. So we started with a group peer support, and I think they're really special and wonderful. That is, if you think a whole team is affected, it's really good to have a facilitated small group team meeting where people could just talk about how they felt. That isn't about, you should have done this, and you're wrong and you're bad, and, not that that's the only way to do that, but it's really not an event analysis, but it does allow people to really talk about where they were, what they experienced, if it just happened a couple hours ago, what they're feeling then, or, a week ago, whenever you can get the group together, to have people talk about what they experienced. And I think they're wonderful to do these. We did notice that that wasn't enough for a couple reasons. One was that there were barriers that were experienced by physicians in particular in those settings, or just generally, I should say, that seemed to prevent physicians from getting much out of a group peer support, because they weren't going to show up as a vulnerable person. They were going to show up as a leader, like, it's okay, team, you did a great job, kind of reassuring other people, but they were not in an multidisciplinary group going to say, I feel incompetent, or I can't sleep, or I've just been obsessing about this and I feel terrible. And so we noticed that, and part of our research was just generally on barriers to getting support. And these were some of the barriers, not lack of time, stigma, lack of confidentiality, but the stigma and confidentiality are a big deal for physicians in particular. So we noticed that, and we also noticed that that there were certain situations that aren't amenable to group peer support. So, for example, let's say a nurse hooked up the wrong IV to the wrong port, and then the patient got a medication in the wrong body cavity, devastating outcome. That's not amenable for group peer support. So for that reason, we added one-on-one peer support. And then, so I trained about 50 non-mental health practitioners to be able to offer peer support. And we got, I'll let you guess for a second, like, how many calls do you think we got of clinicians saying, please help me, something just went wrong, or something went wrong and I feel terrible. And you can guess internally, I don't want to bother you with having to say it out there, but we got none. Nobody called. And so we changed it to a reach out program. And I'll talk about how we reach out, because if you don't have a reach out program, if you just have a resource program like we're here, it will get underutilized. I can pretty much be confident of that. I really can. So, because think about those barriers. For someone to reach out, they have to admit something went wrong and then admit that it's hurting them, which it's not supposed to, right? We're just supposed to be tough and strong, and it's not about us. And so you're really asking a lot of somebody to find that resource and go and get it. And what we decided was, even though we were worried about making it a reach out program, because it basically calls somebody and tells them, hey, I'm here for you, when they haven't asked for that help. So you have to offer it in a way that doesn't feel coercive and also feels very normalizing. And I'll talk about how we set that up. So the question is, I'd like to just say, is like, you might be wondering, why do we need this? I mean, we need support, right? But why not just have all clinicians, say to each other, like, hey, how's it going? I heard you had a bad day yesterday. And what I would say is, like, that's a great thing to do. The problem is a couple things. One is there's a real tendency for us, if we're untrained, to say things that do not help our colleagues. I mean, we're thinking we're helping them, but things like, oh, it's not that bad, the patient's going to recover, or, oh, it could have been worse, or it's not your fault. And the reason those don't work is, like, it minimizes somebody's emotions, and that feels pretty bad to people. They're already feeling bad about feeling emotional. So I think there's a problem with informal peer support. And also, if I ask you, I run into you in the hall or something, or, outside of an exam room, like, about how it went yesterday or how you're doing, is you're not exactly expecting me to, to sit down with you for an hour and listen to how devastated you feel. Like, it just isn't set up for that. So I think, that's what peer support, formal peer support is. It doesn't replace informal. It's just quite different. And then, why don't we just send everybody for mental health services? And the answer is because you saw the data. That's not what people want. And it is not a mental health problem. It could become one, and people should have access and easy access to mental health services if they need them. But it is not initially a mental health problem. It's an occupational massive burden that people really feel like someone only in the profession or in that area who's been there or been in something like it could actually understand and support you for. So here's how the peer support could be done as the outreach program. This is what we do, which would be in the subject line. So I find out that Tony, my colleague, there's a peer support program where in your organization, if an adverse event is reported to, let's say, to risk management or to the chief of service or to the head of the group or to patient safety, they will have a very low threshold for just letting whoever's running the peer support program know, hey, this happened yesterday. It does, not major details or anything, or we know what, all the things about it. Nope, we know this happened. Here are the people involved. And then that director of the peer support program would simply assign a peer supporter to each of the involved players, if you will. So let's say I'm going to do the peer support. I was asked to do it, and so Tony is the person I reach out to. I don't have to know Tony. He doesn't have to know me, doesn't even have to know about the peer support program. So I'll do it in this example as if it's a cold email, like just meaning he has no idea who I am or why I'm doing this. He might know who I am, but he doesn't know. And I would just say, touch base, and in the body of the email, hi, Tony, I'm reaching out as a peer supporter. Give me a call when you have a moment. So very likely he's going to answer that because he's like, I don't know what that is, but okay, sure. I mean, he knows it's not like no one's in trouble because peer support, nobody's afraid, about that. So he calls me. And during the call, that's when I have the opportunity to make this a reach out that is completely normalized. So I would say something like, hey, Tony, he calls me. I go, oh, listen, I'm really glad you called me. I don't know if you know this, but we have a peer support program. And we have this, and we reach out to anybody involved in whatever it was, operative death or an adverse event or an error or a patient aggression, whatever the trigger was. The reason we call anybody, the reason we reach out to anybody is because I and every one of my colleagues has been in a similar situation, something like that. And some of us find it really helpful to talk to a colleague. Is that something you'd like to do? So it's on a platter. I'm not reaching out because Tony's a freak and he's, I think he's going to fall apart. Nope. Everybody gets the offer. Everybody gets the offer. I mean, not for something super minor, of course, but for anything that could be emotionally stressful. We don't wait for people to suffer because we know that this is a vulnerable moment and some people may suffer, and we'd like to get there and, make sure they know some strategies and also they're not alone. Okay, so this is, and you'll have all my slides and everything. So I have a lot of specifics that I won't go over in this hour, but we just wouldn't have time. But they're just actual scripts, things that people can say, and it's what I use when I'm actually training peer supporters. So I already explained what I would say for the outreach call. Okay, so what do we do? So when I train, again, I explained the reason I think training is important. And again, I don't say it's, I'm not claiming it's perfect. Obviously, I'm not perfect. The program isn't going to be perfect, but it seems to be helpful and I would say necessary to train peer supporters because most of us aren't trained to offer this kind of help. Like we're trained to fix things. Someone comes to me, I'm a surgeon, they're coming because they have a problem. They want me to fix it. But with peer support, you really can't fix your colleague's pain. You can offer a lot of help. You absolutely can. And I'll show you, give you examples of how. But it's different from fixing it. And also, those pitfalls of minimizing and those sorts of things, that's what we train people to avoid. And we give them language of ways to ask questions and then offer suggestions in a way that we feel is the least invasive but potentially the most helpful. So and especially for people, like I think palliative care physicians have these skills pretty down, but they have them for, giving essentially patients' bad news, right? And for hearing patients' reactions. But this is hearing colleagues' reactions to their own bad news. And so it's, even for them, it's a little different. But certainly for those of us who aren't used to just sitting with awful feelings, it's really challenging, right? Until you actually get a bit of training to learn how to do it. So I'm not training you now, but I'm just going to give you the foundation is that for you as the peer supporter to be fully present. It sounds like a throwaway, like, of course I'm present, I'm sitting with somebody, but actually it's a presence that's very different from a lot of the ways we're just sort of moving through our lives. Like, how often do you sit with another person and give them your full, undivided attention and are there to respond to whatever they say? Not to tell them stuff they didn't ask, but to listen to what's bothering them and then respond to that. And it requires a sense, not just, like, I know all the good things to say. It requires, like, what is this person asking? And going down that path with them. And so that's why we do training, because people get to practice a bit of that, and I usually do a demonstration of, an example of how to do it. But it's not something we do a lot, just generally. And, it's okay. It's just our lives are structured in kind of a busy way. I don't think it's just in medicine, but giving someone your true presence, you're giving that to your colleague is an amazing gift. Even if you don't have, the absolute right answers, there really aren't any, but your loving presence is huge. And it does require some emotional intelligence and non-judgmental curiosity, like really wanting to understand where someone's at, what they're feeling, what's going on with them. So the fundamentals are, or the parts of it really are the invitation, which I just gave you an example of how to do it. And then and by the way, when you offer peer support to someone, what I would suggest is, like, it depends on what your capacity is, but you could offer it in person. You could offer it by Zoom or Skype if you wanted to, if you have that capacity, or you could offer it by phone. My experience has been that people choose the phone. I don't know why. I think maybe it's just logistically easier for people to set up a peer support meeting by phone, or maybe it's a little less threatening. I'm not sure, but that seems to be the number one choice. But either way, you're going to do the same thing, if you will. So you're going to be listening a lot, but not just listening, and then you're going to reflect on what you're hearing, in a sense of you're validating, like, oh yeah, when someone might say something like, I feel so bad because the family, like, doesn't trust me anymore. And you might say something like, oh, isn't that awful? I've felt that. And it's really like, we're so used to being, trusted and having such good relationships. And all of a sudden we're like the bad guy. That is so hard to manage. Okay, that's like validating, normalizing, like a lot of people feel that way. Someone might say, for example, I just keep obsessing about this. I can't stop thinking about it. And my answer to that would be like, yep, I don't know anyone who doesn't obsess about these events after they happen. That's what we do. And then I actually will give them some suggestions of what they can do about that, which I'll talk about later. But first is just sort of saying, yeah, oh my gosh, that's so common. Or someone says, I can't sleep, or you ask them about their sleeping and you go, yep, it's very common to lose sleep. And then you would talk about that. Reframing is a big thing. And the reframe is having people get a perspective on this. Remember, I was saying that we're wired to really remember the bad. Well, along with that goes forgetting the good. So when something goes wrong, it's pretty much what we think that's all we are. We're just that big error, right? Nothing else. It's just getting people to put it in perspective by asking them, like, I might say, just remind me, how long have you been in practice, or how long have you been in training if it's a resident? Okay, good. Now, how many things have gone like awfully wrong? And most people say like once or twice. It's very uncommon, right? And it's devastating when it happens. And then, think of, I know you're not thinking about this, but, I might encourage you to just remind yourself of all the good that you've done, all the interactions, all the ways you've treated, helped, supported patients and families over the years. It's a lot. It's almost uncountable. Yes, this feels terrible. It is terrible, but it's not who you are. It's something bad that you're going through now. but it's not who you are. So that's the reframing. Encourage, I would say, ask them, have you had an opportunity? Do you have an M&M or root cause analysis or some kind of way to learn from this? Because you've probably, and teach what you've learned, you probably already figured out a lot of things, knowing what you know now that you would have done differently. But having first of all, if you don't share that information with others, someone's going to make the same mistake you made down the line. That's just the way safety works, right? And just so encouraging people to either get more learning from their colleagues, but also share what they've learned, because that is one of the healing factors that we knew from one of our studies that actually helps people heal. Plus, it makes the system safer for patients going forward. We talk a lot about coping. You know, what do people do usually in their lives when they've hit a big bump in the road? What do they do for coping? And you could share coping skills, but I wouldn't start out with saying, you know, I think you should go for a 10-mile run because I really like to run. By the way, I hate running. But I don't think sharing my coping is really the way to go. I think asking what someone else does for coping and what their support system is really important, because a lot of times after an adverse event or any kind of trauma, we stop doing the very things that would be good for us. And we actually sometimes start things that aren't good for us, like drinking or using benzos. And I always bring those up, like, other than those, because they do get in the way of healing, pretty much, you know, you're paying attention to yourself and using coping strategies, you really deserve to do that. And then resources, what other resources? I say, listen, you know, this often will just get better on its own, and through time. But if it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't, it gets under your skin, it gets under our skin. If it does, and you're just not recovering in a timely fashion, please let me know, because I will connect you to resources. We have lots of people around who could help you, and you just need to know, or your peer support, lead needs to know who's the psychiatrist you could call, EAP, whatever resources that you have that somebody might need further. They should be able to, we should either connect them as a warm handoff or at least give them the name and number of somebody. And then closing it, just specific ways to close it. So I'll just skip this slide. Again, you can have all these, but so as I said, there are other factors that help resilience, and one is disclosing and apologizing. And we paired our peer support program with a communication coaching program, disclosure and apology coaching, because I believe a clinician with experience and training in how to have these more difficult conversations with patients and families should be provided to anybody who's going to have one of these conversations. I just think it's really unfair to ask someone to go in there and be compassionate and transparent without some help in thinking about how to do that, just because of some of the emotional trauma and also no experience, we just, fortunately, most of us don't have experience with this. So I think those are important programs. And this is a rhetorical question. Of course, these things do affect how we are. That's why we've got all those awful statistics from Tom Gallagher showing that we're pretty bad at having meeting patients' and families' needs after errors. These are some of the things we do wrong. So we use a coaching to help people avoid these pitfalls because they're very natural given how we feel at the time. I just want to address the this issue of, okay, well, we're doing a peer support intervention, and is it protected? And the answer is it depends on the state you're in. But in Massachusetts, where we started this, and where we've done it for over 10 years, it's not actually. It should be. Of course it should be. Nobody has any business getting into any of this, but it isn't. It's not protected by law. And so we, before we started it, we had this wonderful series of conversations with our risk managers, our defense attorneys, our malpractice insurers, you name it. And we all agreed that, yes, there is some risk, but the risk, and this was my argument and it continues to be, the risk of not doing this, we've got tons of data on that. It's huge. You saw it. Those are just some of the studies showing unsupported clinicians are not in a good place many times, including if they do get sued down the line. So how do you make this as safe as possible? By the way, this also on this slide is there's a website. I'm on the board. I mean, it's not a monetary thing, so I don't have to disclose it, but I'll just tell you, I think the website where we try to put up a whole ton of resources for anybody named in litigation, by the way, which is in and of itself should be a trigger for peer support. But. So the question is, like, how do you keep this safe for people? And you can't guarantee that it would be. I've never heard of it going wrong and being used against anybody, but I still would always say it could never define the risk as zero. So one thing is we do not take any notes, like we do not ever take notes. So there's just no written record of this. So if the peer, who now is a defendant, is asked, did you talk to anybody about this? My guess is that the peer wouldn't say, yes, I got peer support, because that's not really what the plaintiff's attorney is looking for. They're looking for a colleague who weighed in and said, you made a mistake, or I think you should have done it this way. But if they did say, and then they subpoenaed me as the peer supporter, I mean, what am I going to remember? There's no way, 2 years later, I would know or remember the details. There just is no possible way, certainly with a kind of eye to a judgment of what they did. Because that's not, although we let them talk about the event because that's part of the healing. We certainly don't, say like, well, I'm really curious, why didn't you choose that animal, whatever. Well, why did you consider using a different surgical approach? Like that should happen in event analysis. So we don't do that. And so that there's really nothing we could give to the plaintiff's attorney. I would think that would be helpful for them and therefore harmful for the peer. So that's how we've managed, and I would say it seems to work. Some states actually have put this under protection, but it often involves changing a statute or a law or getting it in some kind of under a patient safety umbrella, which is fine. It's great. I mean, I think do it if it's easy to do. We just decided not to do it because we didn't think that the risk was high enough, and we thought the barriers to doing it would be pretty high. So other peer support triggers, I would think, could be adverse events, even if it doesn't have to be a known error. Could be just something went wrong, and I think all of these things should be considered for peer support trigger. I can go through this very briefly. It's not hard to start a program. You need to collaborate with the people who are relevant, like your risk manager. Any group that is going to be the people who are going to most likely hear about events should be in on this, so that they will give you the referral right away. And you don't want them to have their threshold be, I'm just going to refer you people who are sobbing on the phone. It should be everybody gets the call, right? It gets the offer from the peer support program. So you want to collaborate with the leaders and just make sure they're aware and they're supportive. You can't do it alone. That's one thing. You want to have the resources so that the program is not, the peer supporters don't get paid, but someone needs to run this or it will fall apart, I believe. We tried it on, where we had no leader of the program, and we never ended up making the meetings, and no one organized them. And so bottom line was we just got some funding for someone to direct the program. I did direct the program, and then just a manager, part-time. All this was part-time, but just enough to get this running and keep a database de-identified. You want to know who you're serving. Some organizations, they have enough resources that this can be a reach out to anyone on a healthcare team. Others, it's coming from PO funding, physician organization funding. So they're just going to start with this for physicians. Most places will include residents and trainees. Sometimes, it just depends on what the resources are. I have a major suggestion about recruiting and training peer supporters. Let me just go through because I put this. Again, in my slides, everything I'm saying will be put out in more detail. that recruiting and training peer supporters, it shouldn't, I don't think, be just a volunteer program, because some people who think they might be good peer supporters might not be. And so I think the best strategy is peer nominated. And any materials I have, by the way, I'm happy to share with anybody. So we have a letter that you could, or email you could send to a department or the chair of a department, or, you know, or a group or whatever, saying, can I send this out to everybody? And it talks about what the peer support program will be, and then says, would you nominate up to however many people you want nominated, and then, you know, just choose from those people. I think it's great to be peer nominated. I talked about why training and nominations. What are the event triggers? I think you have to decide what you think. I showed you the list of everything I think should be a trigger. I think we're seeing increasing triggers like patient aggression, things like that. But at the very least, you know, adverse events. I mean, at the very least, you know, unless they're just so minor. And you have to remember that the data shows actually somebody could have made an error that doesn't reach the patient. I will acknowledge that that's not likely to get reported. And so we are probably missing people who could use peer support. But at least let's start with the people who, whatever event did get reported to somebody. And it doesn't have to be officially reported. It could be, again, to the chief of the service or what have you. So I just think, you know, low threshold, because all we're doing is asking if they would like support. We are not forcing anybody to do it. And sometimes people they go, you know what, thanks for asking. It's great there's a program. I'm doing fine. I reached out. To be a defendant supporter, by the way, peer supporter, you have to have been through a trial, which I was actually. So I reached out to an orthopedic surgeon, and he, you know, so we talked on the phone. He goes, Joe, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. He goes, this is my fourth. I'm an old hat at it. It's good to go. I'm fine. He's great. So, you know, not everybody says yes, but I'll tell you, everybody appreciates it being asked, because again, we're not singling them out. How do you assign peer supporters? Hard to know, but here are my rules. I don't ever have a junior person peer support a senior person. It just isn't reassuring to have a junior person tell you things are going to be okay. It's just not, you know, or, you know, I've seen this too. Like, well, really? So I think that's a good rule. Generally, I try to do specialty specific if possible, but not granular, like, you know, sort of if it's an invasive interventional injury, I think an interventionalist should do it. OB, I try to have an obstetrician, but when we started, I peer supported. I was the peer supporter, so I did every specialty and multidisciplinary you can imagine, and I think it works. But I do think if you have the resources and you have enough people trained, you know, sort of try to match it generally towards specialty. And I think a de-identified database is good, just so you know what's going on, and then some form of program evaluation. So I'm going to close by saying I think that peer support is a culture change tool. It goes from shame and blame to actually we don't punish for human error. We certainly hold ourselves and each, you know, accountable for what we're accountable for, but we've also got to look at systems, et cetera. Personal invulnerability, this shouldn't, you know, I did this because, you know, I made this mistake because I'm a bad doctor. No, actually, you're human. That happens. Let's try to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. The expectation this shouldn't bother me too. Actually, it bothers any compassionate person, and if it didn't bother you, that would be a bit scary. It takes away the isolation, and then I think a big one is it encourages people to say, you know what, I do need to take care of myself. I do, because this is a career we're talking about, and I want to be able to sustain it, and I can show up better for others in my life if I take care of myself, and also as a human being, I matter too. So I'm just going to leave that. I want to close with saying that I don't use the term second victim. I don't like it at all because the patient advocates I've worked with dislike our referring to ourselves as victims. I mean, they really don't like it. So to me, that's enough reason not to use it anymore. I think it was a great phrase when it started. I just think it should be retired at this point. And also, it's a very passive stance. I think we have a lot of agency in this, that we can really be there to forgive, like I said, forgive ourselves and each other. So I want to close there. And let's see, how are we doing time-wise? Yep, probably just about done.
Joe, thank you very much. I know that we ran a little bit over, but if anyone has any questions, all the lines are unmuted. And Joe, if you have a couple minutes, maybe. Does anyone have any questions?
Here.
Joe?
Hi, Dr. Shapiro. I have a question about your support for the supporters. Do you ever encourage or provide formal coaching training to your supporters? My name is Abdul.
That's a great question. So I've been told by people who have taken my training that, who are they happen to be coaches. They're like, this is coaching. You are giving coaching training. So that's the model of our training. Is exactly. I mean, I've been told that by several different people, and I'm not trained as a coach. But I'm trained as a peer coach. So that's how I. That's the fundamentals, really. It's of the peer support training. As far as other support for the peer supporters, I think it's really important to, if it's a virtual group, but to bring them together either virtually or together. We did it quarterly for some food and debriefing, and also make sure they know that they can access and whoever's leading the program if they have any questions or problems, and not asking them to do too many peer supports. Like, it's not really fair to overwhelm people. And so I try to call on people 4 to 5 times a year, but no more than that. And everybody should have the option to say, hey, Joe, this isn't a good time for me. I'm going on vacation, or I'm just overwhelmed. No problem. We'll find someone else. You're good to go. Thank you. And then trying to, if there's some kind of reward, whether it's in, it's a certificate, or make sure if they're in a department or division, they get honored for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Thank you, Joe. A question: how long do you find the typical peer support conversation?
Yep, there, I should have said. Basically about 45 minutes to an hour, no more than that, really. And it is a one-off. I always ask people at the end, and train people to just say, is it okay if I just check in with you by email in a week or something? And, just like a quick, hey, thinking of you, how you're doing. But if somebody wants, and I've met sometimes more than once, but never more than twice, and I've had people say, oh, this is so helpful, can we talk next week? And my answer is, I'm not really qualified, I'm not your right person, but I can get you someone to talk to. That's not a problem. So you didn't ask that, I know, but yeah, just an hour, about an hour, something like that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Does your program have a corresponding policy and procedure that, say, includes things like no notes will be taken or no communications by email, so that in the event of a discovery request down the road, you can sort of go to that policy and say, yeah, we don't keep any records of the conversation?
We don't have it as a written policy. It's just absolutely known. Like, literally, you cannot be a peer supporter if you don't know that. And so the lawyer, the Office of General Counsel that we were working with when we set that up, she's sort of against policy things. She said she doesn't think they're that helpful, because anyway, so she never encouraged me to make anything like a written policy. But that said, it's never been an issue. People, they know that, no notes. There's one email trail, which is the reach out. Hey, give me a call when you get a chance. That's it, and probably not going to be retrievable. And again, kind of modeling it out, worst comes to worst, you got subpoenaed. What are you going to say? Like, I don't know. I just don't have those details. So, yeah. But, fair enough. But it's not a policy. It's just you cannot do peer support if you don't know that. It's certainly written down in the training.
Joe, thank you very much. I really, really appreciate this. It's a wonderful webinar. And to remind everyone, this is recorded and will be posted along with the materials on the Collaborative for Accountability and Improvement's website, probably in about 3 weeks. But if anyone has any questions or anything, you're welcome to email me, and it's sjlevy@uw.edu, and I'll be happy to forward it to Joe. With that, I guess we can end this. And Joe, thanks again. And it's unfortunate that we didn't have video today because I would have liked to see what costumes everybody was wearing.
Well, I also want to thank everybody for the work you're doing. We've got to change our world here, and this is the way to do it, through all the work around the collaborative and just changing how we treat each other, including patients and families, after things go wrong. So thank you, and I'm so totally happy to help anybody in any way, from afar, what have you. If you have questions, if I can help, I'm very mission driven. So I just want to be there, us to be there for each other. So anytime, just give me a holler.
Thank you.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to end the webinar. Thank you all very much, and have a happy Halloween.
Yep.
You
Happy
too.
safe.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.